Jim, hi.
Hi, Jim. Hi, hi, hi.
Hello. And here we go. I hope I don't have any trouble today. We are expecting a hurricane here in Cancun. So I hope I don't have any trouble with the Wi-Fi. So we're going to start today with the story of Dr. Bob, the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, and the ladies in his life. Dr. Bob was born in St. Johnsbury, Vermont, only about 100 miles from where Bill Wilson was born. They were born in the same state of Vermont. Dr. Bob in a town called St. Johnsbury, and Bill in a place called East Dorset. Dr. Bob says there was no beer or liquor sold in the neighborhood except at the state liquor agency. So they didn't really have any drinking in his town. His father was a judge, and the judge and Mrs. Walter Perrin Smith were prominent citizens in the very typical New England village, and it was only about 7,000 people. That's a picture of Dr. Bob's father. His father also taught Sunday school for 40 years and was a judge in the town. Robert Holbrook Smith, Dr. Bob, who was born at their very large home. There's a picture of the house where Dr. Bob was born on August 8th, 1879. He had a much older foster sister, Amanda Northrup, but he essentially grew up as an only child. Mrs. Smith, his mother, was stern, tight-lipped, church-going lady who busied herself with the countless social and religious activities of St. Johnsbury's towering gray stone church. They went to church a lot, and they said Dr. Bob's mother was a very cold woman. It's a picture of his mother on the left and his father on the right. And there's a picture of Dr. Bob in the middle. He had a very churchy childhood. He was forced to go to church and Sunday school and prayer meetings 4 or 5 times a week. Dr. Bob said in his story, "This had the effect of making me resolve that when I was free from parental domination, I would never again darken the doors of a church." So he was very rebellious. He didn't want to go to church after he became an adult. And they made him go to bed at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And he went at 5 o'clock, but then he sneaked out of his room and joined his friends. That's a picture of his school at the top and the church that they went to at the bottom. He was a boy who liked the outdoors, hunting, fishing, hiking, and swimming. One day while at a neighbor's farm, helping the men at the farm, he discovered apple cider, hard cider, and the irresistible lure prompted a large swallow. He liked the taste of the cider. He was barely 9. It was made out of apples and it was fermented, and he liked it from the very beginning. In the book, Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers, it said, in his teens, Dr. Bob began to spend summers working on a Vermont farm or as a waiter or a bellboy at a hotel in the mountains. Those are the hotels where Dr. Bob worked in the summer as a waiter or a bellboy. And one of the big women in his life was his wife, Ann Ripley Smith. She was referred to by Bill Wilson as the mother of our first group. She was a woman who possessed a deep faith in God and love for those who suffered. That's a picture of Bob's wife, Ann, as a little girl. She was born on March 21st, 1881 in Oak Park, Illinois, close to Chicago, and was one of 4 children. And later we'll talk about them getting married in 1898. Anne Ripley was spending a holiday with a college friend in St. Johnsbury, Vermont, where she met Robert Holbrook Smith. She was small, reserved in temperament. She met her future husband at a dance in the gym at the St. Johnsbury Academy, where he was a senior. Anne was cheerful and aware and calm, and she stayed that way all of her life. There's a picture. If you look on the very far right, you can see a young Dr. Bob standing there. So this was at a high school dance where Anne and Dr. Bob met, and the first time, and they didn't get married for 17 years after they met. Dr. Bob had his medical school to go to, and he wanted to get that out of the way too. And maybe Anne didn't want to marry a drinking man. Another thing, Dr. Bob, I don't know if you know what that's a picture of. Those are scales that people would weigh things on. Dr. Bob wanted to become a medical doctor, but his mother didn't want him to. He had no choice but to get a job. He became a salesman for the Fairbanks Morse manufacturing of scales. So he worked at selling scales, and so he said, I was not particularly successful. And weekends were spent drinking a lot of alcohol. After 2 years, a change of companies took him to Montreal and then to Boston. So he was working at different odd jobs. Dr. Bob attended Dartmouth College, which had a name for being a rugged backwoods school where 800 or so students spent the long winters ignoring their books and drinking as much beer and hard cider as they could. Dr. Bob drank a lot in college, and he was at the university. He was 60 miles away from his parents, so nobody controlled him. At college, he developed a fondness for billiards, horseshoe pitching, and several forms of cards, including the beginnings of a lifelong passion for bridge. Highly competitive, he played to win. He was also a very skilled chug-a-lugger. Chug-a-lugger is someone who can drink the whole beer at one time. So this was at Dartmouth College, and his class picture there at Dartmouth College. Now, guess who was the first AA member who had tattoos? Well, I'll give you a hint. It was one of our co-founders. Most pictures as you see of Dr. Bob, he has long sleeves on, a jacket or a long sleeve shirt. Well, Dr. Bob had a lot of tattoos. It says a tattoo he wore for the rest of his life was probably from the days at Dartmouth, a dragon and a compass tattoo. The dragon wound around his left arm from the shoulder to the wrist, so it was all the way down his arm. It was blue with red fire. And his son said that he had to have been drunk to have it put there because it wasn't something that you could do in just one day. When his son asked him how he got it, Dr. Bob said, boy, that was a dandy. And it must have been too. Another time, some people were in a group of nice people who had their chairs together on the beach in Florida. Said, we invited Bob and his wife to go down to the beach with us. And when Bob appeared in his bathing suit, we saw he was gloriously tattooed on his chest and both arms, with rather intriguing figures and snakes and so forth. Dr. Bob had a lot of tattoos. Most of the time he got them when he was drinking. This is a very blurry, bad picture, but if you look closely at his arms, you can see that they are dark where the tattoos were. All right, so then he went. Made pledges and promises. He finally persuaded his parents to send him to medical school. But his constant drinking caused him to get expelled from the University of Michigan after his second year. With the help of his father, he got transferred to Rush University, where his shaking from too much drinking caused him to miss several classes. And his life in school became one long binge after another, and he was no longer drinking for the sheer fun of it. Things kept getting worse and worse, and his classmates contacted his father, who tried to help him get over his drinking, but it didn't really work. During one final exam, he couldn't even take it. His hands were shaking too much. And remember, this was a long time ago when he was in school. This is what, medical school looked like then in those days. But then he went to Rush Medical School after getting kicked out of the University of Michigan to Rush Medical, where his drinking would land him in trouble again. And he was on probation again. He managed to get things together and stayed sober long enough to graduate. If you consider all this chaos, Bob must have been very extraordinary. Medical school is difficult just to gain interest and more difficult to graduate from. Rush Medical was named to honor the physician and founding father of the United States, Benjamin Rush, who was one of the first people to say that alcoholism was a disease. And here's his picture from his graduation from Rush Medical College. You see a picture of him in the top left there. That was his graduating class when he graduated from Rush Medical Academy. Then Dr. Bob says in his story, he said, "I conducted myself so creditably, I was able to secure a much coveted job in a Western city where I spent 2 years. During these 2 years, I was kept so busy that I hardly left the hospital at all. Consequently, I could not get into any trouble. The new doctor opened an office downtown in the Second National Bank building where he was to remain until he retired. Because of his long hours and intense work as a doctor, he developed stomach trouble. In his story, he says, I soon discovered that a couple of drinks would alleviate my gastric distress, at least for a few hours. Didn't take him long to return to his old drinking habits. And immediately he began to pay very dearly physically to know the horror and suffering of alcoholism. So he had quit when he was in college to graduate from medical school, but then after a while, he started drinking again. That's the building where he had his office in Akron, Ohio. When he was drinking so bad, he could not function. The new medical practitioner, the new doctor, put himself into one of the local drying out spots, places like detox centers that we have today. And he often, even when he was in those places, he would smuggle in whiskey. And so he was drinking a lot. Here's a graduating class of the Firestone School of Nursing. On the left-hand side, you can see Dr. Bob in his long sleeve shirt standing there. He was the resident physician there. So in 1914, his father, Judge Smith, dispatched a doctor to bring Bob home, where he remained in bed for 2 full months before daring to go out. He was utterly demoralized. Scared straight, Smith stayed sober and believed he was that way to stay. He went to Chicago to finally marry Anne, which he did on January 25th, 1915. It was about a full year since his last drink. Dr. Bob had brought his wife home to 855 Ardmore Avenue in New York. The $4,000 house was new then, a two-story clapboard structure. With Dr. Bob's professional life going smoothly now and his practice growing, the Smiths became parents in 1918, the year of Robert Smith Jr.'s birth. It was also the year the 18th Amendment prohibition was passed. At the prospect of the whole country growing dry, I felt quite safe. A few drinks at that point would make little difference. His thinking, if not quite logical, was quite typical at that time. So that's their son, Robert Smith Jr. And this was at a time of prohibition when when selling alcoholic beverages was illegal in the United States. Most of Bill and Bob's drinking happened when alcohol was illegal in the United States. So, that's a picture of Dr. Bob and Ann with their pit bull Roger, dog Roger. After starting out moderately, Dr. Bob, of course, like we do, he drifted out of control again. In spite of the problems stemming from Bob's drinking, 5-year-old Sue was adopted. So there was Bob, there's a picture of young Bob Jr. on the right, and then they adopted Sue. Anne, his wife, then in her mid-40s, had been advised that she could not have any more children. And Sue and Smitty were about 5 months apart in age. The children remembered their father as irritable and cross when he was drinking. They were ashamed of his slavery to booze and sympathized with their mother, who was trying to hold the penniless family together, praying that her husband would somehow find an answer to his problem. One of the less known stories in A.A. history is that of Sue and Robert Smith. Sue was born in 1918 to a broken family. She was institutionalized for 2 years and later adopted as Robert's sister when both children were 5 years old. They grew up in the well-kept house in the working-class suburbs of Akron, a neighborhood where the local kids would gather in the street with their fathers and play ball. So that's Dr. Bob and Smitty and Sue, again, a little bit older. Dr. Bob with his son. Their mother, Anne, was a kind, intelligent woman who busied herself with crafts and homebound artistic pursuits and enjoyed listening to political debates and opera on the family radio. Their father, Dr. Bob, was a respected, charismatic doctor, a specialist who kept up on new slang and was able to engage in a friendly conversation. So Dr. Bob was now a doctor, just a regular general practitioner, a medical doctor. After a while, he developed an interest in surgery. Following further training at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, and Jefferson Medical School in Philadelphia, he began in 1929 to specialize as a proctologist, a rectal surgeon. He was also first call surgeon in Akron for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad for many years. If there was an illness or an accident in the area, he was the first doctor called, and this provided him with some extra money. So he became a rectal surgeon, a proctologist. There's a picture of Dr. Bob in the American Proctological Society. He liked cars. He really liked cars from very young age. And he kept his car at the Central Garage. And he talked about the boys at Central Garage. What happened was he would park his car there when going to the office. And then when he was too drunk to drive, the boys at the Central Garage would drive him home. So they were like the Uber of Dr. Bob's day. But he did. He loved cars. He loved all kinds of cars, and he kept enjoying cars all of his life. That's a picture of their house there on the right. If you don't have to count them, but if you count them, you will see that there are 12 steps up to his house. The Smith family lived in that house, and it was purchased in 1915 for $4,000. And it's very ordinary. There's nothing special to it. And it recalls Dr. Bob shared the simple ways of his Vermont ancestors. And it was a difficult house for Mrs. Smith, as Dr. Bob once more fell into the pit of destructive drinking. A good doctor, of course, needing to earn an income, had various ways of managing his drinking. And this he talks about in Dr. Bob's story. His drinking, he would no morning drinking, usually, and he would take sedatives. He would take drugs instead to quiet the shaking in the morning. And today we would say that he has a dual addiction. Dr. Bob said, I had sense enough never to go to the hospital if I had been drinking, and very, very seldom did I receive patients. He says on a good day, he would stay dry, but well sedated until 4 o'clock, and then go home and start drinking. And there's a picture of his kids with their dog, Roger. Then 5 years after the birth of Robert Jr., the daughter Sue was adopted, and as they grew up, they became more and more aware of their father's alcoholism. They have fond childhood memories nonetheless. Possibly to counterbalance his own strict upbringing, Dr. Bob was the most liberal of parents. The long-suffering and frustrated Mrs. Smith, however, took up cigarette smoking in her 50s and became a chain smoker. She was just nervous. She was boiling inside. Dr. Bob, again, like we all do, made promises to his wife and children and to stop drinking, but they usually didn't last for a day. By 1933, the country's full-blown depression, combined with Dr. Bob, a breadwinner who only rarely went to work, left the Smiths in economic desperation. Only the national mortgage moratorium kept the family from losing their house. Dr. Bob was often irritable, and this irritability was without a doubt magnified when Anne dragged him off to the Oxford group. Because his parents had forced him to go to church, and he just didn't like church and religious things. But what had happened, they finally got married. But then for 17 years, this nightmarish existence had gone on, and Anne and their 2 children living in the shambles of broken promises. Unwilling to see their friends, they existed on the bare necessities. Even in those bleak depression years, fewer and fewer patients were willing to trust their bodies to a surgeon whose hands trembled. Dr. Bob was a proctologist, and he had seen the humor in, but had not deeply appreciated a comment. He heard someone, remember Dr. Bob is a proctologist, a rectal surgeon. I assume that you all know what that means. Anyway, one of the doctors at the hospital where he worked said that when you go to Dr. Smith, you really are betting your ass. I don't know if you understand that joke, but they said he was not a particularly good surgeon as a proctologist. So this Oxford group had come into Akron in January of 1933 when the rubber company president, Harvey Firestone, grateful because the Oxford group had sobered up his son, Russell, brought 60 Oxford group leaders and team members to Akron for a 10-day house party, as their gatherings were called. They held meetings throughout the day, and it all culminated in a dinner for 400 prominent citizens in the community. This group profoundly attracted Ann Smith, who dragged her recalcitrant husband to this altar of potential redemption. Dr. Bob says, my wife became deeply interested, and it was her interest that had sustained mine, though I at no time thought it might be the answer to my liquor problem. Anne was a woman of faith, and she pressed on, and not without challenges. Anne was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, and their two children, of course, were greatly upset. Hope was a word they had come to avoid. At the age of 56, again, Anne took up smoking, possibly to graphically demonstrate to her husband the effects of his self-indulgence. So that's a picture of Anne at the top. And at the bottom is a lady, another one of the ladies in his life, Henrietta Seiberling. So in the spring of 1935, Henrietta Seiberling felt guided, inspired, that the Oxford group should have a special meeting for Bob Smith. They were successful in getting Dr. Smith to confess for the first time his difficulty with alcohol. Dr. Bob, in one of the Oxford group meetings, said, "I'm a secret drinker and I can't stop." So that was Dr. Bob in the Oxford group. So by the spring of 1935, there were things that Bill Wilson, now 5 months sober, knew as well. His town's hospital spiritual experience, along with the religious practices of the Oxford group in New York, were insufficient in themselves to sustain his sobriety. A few years later, he would write, quote, "I soon found that when all measures failed, work with another alcoholic would save the day." And of course, the big book says practical experience shows that nothing will so much ensure immunity from drinking as intensive work with other alcoholics. And so he was at the Mayflower Hotel. His business had gone very bad, and he heard music and talking coming from the bar in the hotel. And he thought, maybe I should go in the bar and just have a ginger ale. And so he knew he was in trouble. So he went to the telephone, and he started calling. He said to himself, he said, "I need another alcoholic to talk to." So he made telephone calls. He made about 10 telephone calls. And eventually, he got a hold of the Reverend Walter Tunks, and Bill said, "I'm from the Oxford group in New York, and I'm looking for another drunk to talk to." And so Reverend Tunks connected Bill to Henrietta Seiberling, and they went out to her home. And it was Henrietta Seiberling, of course, who telephoned the Smiths, about the rum hound, the drunk from New York, who had found an answer to his alcohol problem. Her husband, Dr. Bob, was too drunk to make the trek to the Seiberling gatehouse that Saturday, but she wrangled his reluctant promise to go the next day. So this happened, the phone call to Henrietta on May 11th, 1935. And then she called Ann Smith and said, "Have Dr. Bob come over." But Dr. Bob was too drunk to come over. So they went over on Mother's Day, May 12th, to Henrietta's home. And there's a picture, that's Bob Smith Jr. He drove them over there. And that in the middle there, that's the room where Dr. Bob and Bill met and talked for about 6 hours. And now as he finished his story, something began to dawn on Dr. Bob Smith. Slowly at first, then with sudden clarity, he understood. Bill Wilson had been able to control his drinking problem by the very means, the Oxford group. Bill was going to the Oxford group in New York, and Bob was going to the Oxford group in Akron. And Bob himself had been trying to use the Oxford group, but there was a difference. The spiritual approach was useless as any other if you soaked it up like a sponge and kept it to yourself. The purpose of life wasn't to get, it was to give. For all his dabbling in religion and philosophy, Dr. Smith had never before realized that simple and now obvious fact. The one thing that Dr. Bob learned from Bill was helping another alcoholic, an alcoholic talking to another alcoholic. So after that, Henrietta Seiberling arranged for Bill to move into the Portage Country Club. That's a picture of that there. As the guest of her neighbor, John Gameter. Lois, Bill's wife, was less than impressed to hear that her unemployed husband was playing golf and hanging around with wealthy people in the country club. There didn't seem to be much happening in his work at the proxy fight, and I can't say I liked thinking about his playing golf at a fancy country club while I was working at a Lowe's, a department store. After a couple of weeks, Bill moved in with Dr. Bob and Ann, moved in with the Smiths, and stayed until the end of August. The two men diligently searched for others to help, often lodging them in the already cash-strapped Smith home. They didn't have, that's a picture of Dr. Bob's living room there at the bottom. And the progress Dr. Bob said, one day he said, Bill, if you and I are going to stay sober, we'd better get to work. So what did they do? Did they go to church? Did they get down on their knees and pray? Did they read the Bible? I don't know. Maybe they did all those things. But the only thing that we know that they thought was important was that they went and started talking to other alcoholics. So during the summer of 1935, both co-founders worked tirelessly to maintain their own sobriety while trying to help others. Even before the trip to the AMA convention, they found a young guy by the name of Eddie Riley. That's Eddie on the right hand. He had just been thrown out on the street. He had a cute little blonde wife and 2 kids. And so they decided to move all of them into the Smith home. They locked Eddie upstairs in the bedroom so he couldn't get out and drink. But he got out anyway, and by sliding down the water drains. And he went all the way to Cleveland, where he was going to commit suicide. When he sobered up, he had a few things that hadn't shown up immediately. He had a lot of other problems. And he began beating up on his blonde wife and chasing Ann around the house with a butcher knife. And so there, right after Dr. Bob got sober, they talked to a couple of people. They talked to Eddie Riley, and then there was a Dr. Roy McKay. They were likely the first and second people that they talked to. Dr. McKay never achieved permanent sobriety, but Eddie Riley eventually did. Eddie, not in the beginning. He missed his chance to be AA number 3. But he just stayed drunk for a while. But when he went to Dr. Bob's funeral in 1950, he was sober, and he stayed that way. So anyway, after Dr. Bob stopped drinking and they were working on with other alcoholics, Bill Wilson moved into the home. Then there had to be an AMA, an American Medical Association convention, about a month later, in June of 1935. And Dr. Bob said, I had a great thirst, a thirst for knowledge, he said. And He had another kind of thirst, actually. So anyway, he wanted to go to that medical convention and told Bill, he said, don't let him go. He always gets drunk. And Bill said, well, if he's going to get drunk, he's going to get drunk. We can't keep him from that. So he went, he got on the train, he bought a fifth of whiskey, and he sure did stay drunk the whole convention. And then he came back, and Bill sobered him up, and he never had a drink after that. So in their house, they worked hard during the period to put together a little talk that they could give to other drunks. Dr. Bob noted that there were no 12 steps at the time. There was no book. There were no 12 steps. And really, the stories didn't really amount much of anything. They had no experience. What they did in their mornings, they would have prayer and meditation, and they talked about the Sermon on the Mount and the book of James. The book of James, that's where the phrase faith without works is dead comes from. And they would read that, and they would also read from the 1 Corinthians chapter 13 that talks about love. If I could speak all the languages of the earth and of angels, but didn't have others, love others, I would only be a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And I have to have love first. Dr. Bob said, I didn't write the 12 steps. I had nothing to do with writing them, but I think I probably had to do with them indirectly. There was hardly a night during the 3 months of Bill's stay in the summer of 1935 that we didn't sit up until 2 or 3 in the morning talking. So they were talking about how to help other people get sober. All this happened, Dr. Bob said, at a time when everybody was broke. Nobody had money. It was a depression time. Everybody was awfully broke. A lot of times in the Smith house, all they had was potato soup. It was probably much easier for us to be successful at A.A. when nobody had money. That's what he said. In addition, to Eddie, there were a couple of other alcoholics around in the summer and fall of 1935 who didn't gel, who didn't get sober. So they had a lot of failures in the beginning. There was a man called Victor. He was a former mayor of Akron, and a lady we'll call Lil. She was the first woman to seek help. Together, Victor and the lady known as Lil started out to write the 13th step long before the first 12 were ever thought of. What is more, they say it began in Dr. Bob's office, on his examination table, while he was at the club engaged in a bridge game. In any case, Victor decided it was time for him to go home. He and Lil were having fun on Dr. Bob's examination table, and Lil was drunk, and so he called people, and Lil had little pills from Dr. Bob's cabinet, and they were chasing each other around, both of them drunk in Dr. Bob's examining room. So after that, Dr. Bob didn't want anything to do with women, with helping them. And but finally, on June 28th, 1935, Dr. Bob and Eddie visited Bill D., whose big book story is Alcoholics Anonymous #3, at the City Hospital of Akron. Bill D. was a prominent attorney, a barrister, and he was hospitalized 8 times in it was only June, and he'd already been in the hospital 8 times in 1935 for his drinking. It took 5 days before he could admit he couldn't control his drinking. On U.S. Independence Day, July 4th, he checked out of the hospital never to drink again. Akron's group #1 marks its beginning as the date that Bill D. left the hospital. Although he is anonymously discussed in the Big Book chapter, A Vision for You, Bill Dee's personal story did not appear in either the original manuscript or the first edition of the Big Book. Why? Nobody is sure. But he was a delegate when the conferences started, and Bill went to Akron to personally record Bill Dee's story so it could be included in the second edition of the Big Book, which was published in 1955. He was very active in A.A. all of his life, William Dotson, and until he died in 1954. So he never, he did his, gave a recording of his story for the Big Book, but he died in 1954. And the big second edition Big Book didn't come out until 55. So he never saw his story in the Big Book. And he's buried there in Akron next to his wife, Henrietta Dotson, another Henrietta, but he was A.A. number 3. Another lady in Dr. Bob's life was his adopted daughter, Sue. And in A.A. history, Ernie Galbraith, pictured here, Ernie is called A.A. number 4. And, sometimes I wish we could change that, but we can't. His story was in the Big Book. It was taken out later, but was in the Big Book as A.A. He's listed as A.A. number 4. And Dr. Bob got him sober. And Sue was dating a guy by the name of Ray Windows. And And she was going with the guy Ray, and Dr. Bob didn't like him. Dr. Bob wanted her to get together with Ernie. And but Ernie never gelled as an A.A., according to Dr. Bob. Sue remembered that they didn't really know what to do with him. He even got to where he wanted to get paid for speaking at meetings. He had periodic relapses, which got worse and worse until the time he died. Dr. Bob's daughter, Sue, was only about 17 at the time, and that was the first time she saw Ernie. And there again in yellow, Sue had been seeing a boy named Ray Windows. She claims that her parents disapproved of Ray and tried to break them up. She believes her father, Dr. Bob, deliberately tried to get her interested in Ernie to keep her away from Ray. And she said, I think my dad got the idea that if he could get Ernie to take me out and he'd pay the way, Dr. Bob paid for the dates, he might be able to get me away from Ray. We'd go down and get hamburgers and Dad, Dr. Bob, would buy them. I knew all the time what he was doing. So Dr. Bob was trying to get her with Ernie. When Ray got a job out of town and moved away, Ernie gradually started to have some appeal. She didn't have Ray, so she started going with Ernie. And it said he would make Mom and Dad laugh, and they were pushing me. Dr. Bob and Ann were pushing her to go with Ernie. Sue still saw Ray when he would come home for visits, but eventually she broke it off with Ray and married Ernie. Her parents disapproved, perhaps for other reasons, but certainly because they knew Ernie was drinking again. He was drunk when he married Sue in September of 1941. Dr. Bob and Ann did not attend the wedding. Sue said she never told them she was married and believed they'd heard about it or read it in the newspapers. So Sue moved out of her parents' home about 9 months before. And Dr. Bob said to her, just remember, young lady, wherever you go, you take yourself with you. That was not a particularly happy situation, and it got worse. Sue said that Ernie continued drinking that time until about 1946, when the only reason he quit was the doctor thought he had a heart condition, and it scared him to death. Sue said, I don't think he ever had a heart condition. I don't think he even had a heart. While Sue was somewhat reconciled with her parents, apparently they were again never close. Sue said they didn't visit or send flowers when her children were born. They had 2 children. They never said anything to Sue about Ernie, but she believes her father, Dr. Bob, would talk to other people about him. She said, I heard Dad, Dr. Bob, grew a healthy dislike for him, and Bill, well, Bill came down one time when Ernie and I were still together. And Bill and I made this tape recording about A.A. and Dad, about Dr. Bob. But on the tape, Ernie said something to Bill, and Bill shot back at Ernie and said, I gave up on you a long time ago, you son of a bitch. That's right on the tape, Bill telling him. Sue and Ernie had 2 children, a son, Mickey, and a daughter, Bonna. Ernie and Sue divorced about 1965, and he remarried, and things get worse. There was a picture of Bonna, the daughter Bonna, and her daughter. On June 11th, 1969, Bonna shot herself after first killing her 6-year-old daughter. She was 23 at the time. Sue claims that Bonna was an alcoholic and was also using diet pills. Sue wrote, Ernie never got over it. Bonna died June 11th, 1969, and he died 2 years later to the day, June 11th, 1971. Later, Sue married her childhood sweetheart, Ray Windows. A sad story. The Prince of the 12 Steppers. Lois described Dr. Bob as being full of humanity. He definitely wanted to help people in trouble. And he was so excited and enthusiastic about this new thing he and Bill had. Bill realized, too, that he'd got things from Bob that he needed to complement his work. He always consulted with Bob, who usually went along with Bill. Dr. Bob was tough. He was inflexible. He told his prospects, do you want to surrender to God? Take it or leave it. Again, down at the bottom there, it says, women were not welcome. Young people were not welcome. They said, well, you haven't suffered enough. You're too young. And what did exist at the time was very much a Christian fellowship. In the Oxford group, they had quiet time, prayer, and Bible readings, and these were an integral part of the healing process. And Dr. Bob continued his efforts with alcoholics in Akron in close connection with the Oxford group. Sometimes we hear that Dr. Bob sponsored 5,000 people. Well, that's not true. I mean, he got sober in 1935. He was sober when he died for 15 years. If you do the mathematics, it just doesn't work out, but he did treat them as a doctor. A total of 4,800 alcoholics were admitted into St. Thomas Hospital under his care. Before the first of the St. Thomas Hospital admissions started in August 1939, there had been others treated in the previous 4 years at the other 2 hospitals where Dr. Bob had his affiliations. What an enormous humanity this reflects. One would think that no aggrandizement is required, but we often hear that Dr. Bob sponsored 5,000, and that's more than 1 per day, taking Sundays off. So he did give free medical care to 5,000, and it says in another history book, it says, he treated almost 5,000 alcoholics without charge, most of them at St. Thomas Hospital. Hundreds he had worked with, had treated, wound up in A.A. So of the 5,000, hundreds ended up in A.A. Then there was a problem in Cleveland. Dorothy Snyder, Clarence Snyder's wife, heard of a doctor in Akron. She was in Cleveland, who had been successful in treating alcoholics. She offered him, Clarence, her husband, the alternative of going to see Dr. Bob or her leaving for divorce, for good and getting a divorce. So Clarence agreed, and that was the turning point in his life. While in the hospital, a plan for living was explained to him, and Clarence had his last drink on February 11th, 1938. I think maybe one of these weeks in the future, we're going to do the story of Clarence and Cleveland in a little more depth. But Clarence became an enthusiastic 12th stepper, dragging people off of bar stools. And Clarence started the first AA group in Cleveland in 1939. In part because the Roman Catholic priests in Cleveland were refusing to let Catholics attend the Oxford group meeting in Akron. See, the Oxford group meeting was a Protestant meeting, and the Roman Catholic priests didn't like that their people were going to the Protestant meetings. That's a picture of Clarence there. So Dr. Bob said, well, you know, we're not keeping the Catholics out. The church is keeping them out of the meetings. And Dr. Bob said, well, we can't do anything about that. Dr. Bob was not going to quit the Oxford group. He did not want to be disrespectful to the Oxford group people who had saved his life. And then nothing at all could or would be done to resolve the impossible religious conflict that the Cleveland Catholics found themselves. So Doc Smith felt that since there was nothing else to offer these alcoholics than what they had in the Oxford group, he just couldn't do anything. He could offer Clarence no solution. No solution other than to keep talking to church officials and trying to convince them to let the Catholics go to Protestant meetings. Well, that's not going to work. The church doesn't change. And so the church was saying, to the members, if you continue to go to the Protestant meetings, we're going to not give you confession and communion. So there was a problem. So in 1939, the big book was published, the Alcoholics Anonymous, and it had immediate consequences for the Cleveland alcoholics. Clarence Snyder believed it offered a solution to his problem. He went back to Dr. Bob and said, I think I have a solution. Dr. Bob said, well, what do you have in mind? And Clarence says, well, we're going to start a new group without all this stuff that's offensive to other people. We have a book now, the steps, the absolutes. Anyone can live by that program. We can start our own meetings. And Doc Smith said, well, we can't abandon these people, the Oxford group people. We owe our lives to them. Clarence said, so what? I owe my life to them too. But what about these others? And well, we can't do anything about them, Doc Smith said. And Clarence says, oh, yes, we can. You just watch. So Clarence had recently hospitalized a Cleveland patent attorney named Abby G. While Abby was still in the hospital, Clarence Snyder told Abby's wife that he was looking for a place to hold a meeting in Cleveland, and she had offered their own large home. That's a picture of Abby, and that's their home. In early May, Clarence announced at the Akron meeting that the Clevelanders were leaving the Oxford group and would begin their own meeting the following week. Our policy will mainly be not too much stress on spiritual business at meetings. Well, some of the Oxford group members were angry and at what they saw as betrayal. They attempted to argue with Clarence after his announcement. When he made the mistake of revealing the address, the location of Abby's home, some of them showed up at the first meeting to continue their protest. They invaded the house and tried to break up our meeting. Clarence said, one fellow was going to beat me up, all in the name of Christian charity. So Clarence said, AA started in riots. Well, at that first meeting, Dr. Smith stayed home. But he quickly reconciled himself to the break between the groups and began attending the meeting in Cleveland once or twice a month. While he was reluctant to anger his close friends, he understood the reasons for starting the group in Cleveland, which was soon describing itself as a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. This was the first group meeting that was named after the book, Alcoholics Anonymous. By the end of 1939, Dr. Smith was convinced that the Akron Alcoholics too had to find a new home. There were some hot conversations on the telephone. It was a three-way thing. The women decided it. It was Henrietta and Anne. They were the ones that finally decided it. In December, as many as 70 people began cramming into the living room of the Smiths' small home on Wednesday nights. So if you can imagine, that's their living room. You can imagine 70 people there in their home for the meeting. And that's their living room. Because Doc Smith had said, we don't have a place to meet. We'll meet at my house. It was in November or December because I remember the Christmas tree in their living room. So at this first meeting of Alcoholics Only in Akron, without fuss or bother, Dr. Bob announced that there would be a meeting for the alcoholics. When the meeting came to order, all of the little band were there. Dr. Bob put his foot on the rung of the dining room chair, identified himself as an alcoholic. My name's Bob and I'm an alcoholic, and began reading the Sermon on the Mount. On the second day of the new year, 1940, Dr. Bob wrote a letter to Bill and said, we have definitely shaken off the shackles of the Oxford group and are meeting at my house for the time being. Had 74 Wednesday in my little house, but shall get a hall soon. So AA had declared its independence from the Oxford group. The positives and negatives of the Oxford group. Well, the alcoholics used the Oxford group methods as a way to solve their own specific issues, including the vital, we admitted we were licked, that we were powerless over alcohol. And yet AA broke away, New York in 1937, and Cleveland next in May of 1939, and Akron last and most reluctantly at the end of 1939. The best analysis of the positives and negatives of the Oxford group AA relationship can be found in Ernie Kurtz's AA history book, Not God, The History of Alcoholics Anonymous. Some of the most pressing reasons for the separation were that AA steadfastly and consistently, one, avoided absolutes, and the Oxford group had the absolutes. Number two, AA avoided aggressive evangelism, embraced anonymity. The Oxford group wanted celebrities. And four, AA strove to avoid offending anyone who might be helped by the program. One of the other very important ladies in Dr. Bob's life was, of course, Sister Ignatia, called the Angel of AA. In the spring of 1939, administrators at Akron City and Green Cross hospitals, noting that Dr. Bob's mysterious patients owed over $5,000, began scrutinizing his admissions more carefully. He asked Sister Ignatia, the admissions officer at St. Thomas, if he could smuggle in some alcoholic patients. Dr. Bob knew that the good sister was sympathetic to the cause. We often discuss the problem of alcoholism and the tragedies caused by excessive drinking. There's absolutely no denying the convincing evidence that throughout his 15 years of sobriety, Dr. Bob labored in the service of his fellow alcoholic at a level virtually unparalleled throughout the larger AA world. The more flamboyant Bill Wilson was the public face of the society. But in Ohio, the figure of Dr. Bob was the curt, devoted medical man. The tarnishing of Bill W.'s star in the past few decades has led to an elevation of his co-founder's legacy. It happens with other mythic figures. Dr. Bob was He worked with alcoholics. That was his thing. He wasn't a writer or a publicity man. He just worked with alcoholics. And of course, there in St. Thomas Hospital, he worked with Sister Ignatia. And an article about her and the work that they did there at St. Thomas Hospital. And she wrote in 1951, I think, she wrote something. She wrote how it worked at St. Thomas Hospital in Akron by Sister Ignatia. So she's actually talking about what they did when people went into the hospital in Akron. And the patient is admitted to the hospital. After registration, the sponsor escorts his patient to the AA ward. So they had a sponsor right from the beginning. The ward is virtually self-governing. 2 or 3 of the senior patients in the ward take over and welcome the new patient. They check his clothes and prepare him for bed. Many of these patients are in good condition and they sit in the lounge and enjoy the conversation. They make the new man feel at home. The reception inspires hope in the heart of the new person. So the second day in the hospital is the day of realization. The physical condition of the patient is usually much improved on the second day. His mind is beginning to clear and he feels encouraged because someone seems interested in him. Visitors call on him, telling him, "This is how I made it." People would come in one after another and tell their stories. Some of the visitors may be men with whom he used to drink. The power of example is a great example to the patient. He begins to say to himself, if he can do it, so can I. But how am I going to make it? At this point, he generally has a good heart-to-heart talk with his sponsor. He acknowledges his utter powerlessness over alcohol. He honestly admits that he has tried time and time again to drink normally and has always failed. He's finally ready, honestly and humbly, to admit defeat. His sponsor is delighted to know that his patient is really honest about his drinking. The sponsor says, "Good, we can help you since you are humble and honest." This is the grace of God at work in the soul of the patient. So on the third day, the day of moral inventory, the patient makes a searching and fearless moral inventory. He faces the past honestly, admits to God, to himself, and to another human being the exact nature of his wrongs. He's finished with alibis and reservations. I'm an alcoholic. What a joy to be honest. The truth will make you free. On the fourth day, the day of resolution, give us this day our daily bread. This is interpreted by the alcoholics to mean, I surely can stay sober today. This is usually followed by an act of complete surrender to God. The past is finished. I'm heartily sorry. I will try to make amends. This means confession, repentance, and firm purpose of amendment. Many Catholics return to the sacraments after years of negligence. Scripture says there is more joy in heaven over one sinner than 99 who do not need penance. He used to drink because he felt like it. He permitted his emotions to run away with him. Now with God's help and the help of fellow AAs, he can clear his thinking and control his feelings. So one day at a time, we can do it. On the fifth day, then there are plans for the future. As he leaves the hospital, he must now face his problems. The way has been paved by the sponsor. The future is in God's hands. He has learned to say, "Oh God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference." And before he left, he's given a copy of the Imitation of Christ and a Sacred Heart badge. Sister Ignatia gave them that. And under the condition, they said, before you take a drink, bring this back to me. So following Dr. Bob's death in 1950, Sister Ignatia continued her work at St. Thomas. And then she went to St. Vincent's Hospital in Cleveland and continued work with alcoholics. This is like a handmade, homemade certificate that that they gave to Sister Ignatia. It was signed by Bill. We of Alcoholics Anonymous look upon you as the finest friend and the greatest spirit we may ever know. So I'm going to, as usual, running out of time. So there is, I'm going to skip a couple of these. In Akron, they used the big book, but Dr. Bob didn't think it was really the best thing for the common man. And so he had a booklet made up called A Manual for Alcoholics Anonymous. Again, in yellow, where it says, this booklet is intended to be a practical guide for new members and sponsors. The book should be used in conjunction with the larger book, Alcoholics Anonymous, the Bible, and the daily lessons. I think if we have time one of these weeks, we'll be talking about the Akron manuals that talked a lot about how to stay sober and how to work the steps. Dr. Bob was big on easy does it. I get in the morning when I get up, I put my feet on the floor. I have to battle all day to stay away from that drink. Dr. Bob told members to stay in dry places. And he supported the Little Red Book that Ed Webster wrote, an interpretation of the 12 steps and how to do the 12 steps. His life, when all other measures fail, work with another alcoholic would save the day. Dr. Bob did a lot of that, as we've talked before. He loved playing bridge, and he tried to be a better father and husband after he got sober. In June of 1948, Dr. Bob was diagnosed with terminal cancer. He closed his office and retired from practice. Bill W. was spurred into greater urgency as Dr. Bob's illness progressed. He pressed harder for the General Service Conference to take the place of the A.A. founders. Bill wanted this conference and the approval of the traditions, and a lot of people didn't want that. And he wanted to, it resulted in a lot of hot debates, and a serious rift developed between Bill and the trustees. And he wanted to convince Dr. Bob that the conference was a good thing, that it would take the place of the founders. And Dr. Bob was hesitant, but after he was diagnosed with cancer, he realized too that the founders were not going to be around forever, so that we needed a conference. Ann Smith was no hypocrite as she continued to support her husband. Both were dedicated to helping both drunkards and their spouses to recover from the horrible affliction that is active alcoholism. Emma Kay, who brought her husband to the Smiths for help with his drinking, reported, "They were always doing things for you. They couldn't do enough." Emma was a nurse and spent a lot of time with Ann Smith. In her last days, vision was a problem for Ann, and she had a cataract operation that failed. At the end of her life, she could hardly see, hardly walk, and her hands were crippled with arthritis. She was a selfless woman and not a complainer. She did express disappointment at her husband's lack of acknowledgement in New York. Dr. Bob was barely recognized in New York, but of course in Ohio, the situation was reversed. On June 1st, 1949, Ann Ripley Smith, age 69, died at St. Thomas Hospital. Sister Ignatia secretly baptized her as an act of love prior to her death. Ann was much revered by the Akron members and by Bill and Lois. Her last years were spent nearly blind due to cataracts. There was Bill wrote in the Grapevine, in the full sense of the word, she was one of the founders of AA. Ann's remains were sent to Cleveland for cremation prior to her burial in Akron. There on the right-hand side is what Bill wrote in the Grapevine. She was quite literally the mother of our first group, Akron #1, and she was one of the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous. Dr. Bob watched the progress of his own disease each day. He knew that the malady of cancer was malignant and hopeless, and accepted it with serenity and a lack of resentment. He felt no bitterness toward the doctors who'd failed to find it earlier. Why should I blame them? I've probably made a lot of fatal mistakes myself. There in yellow, it says, after Ann's death, he and Dick Stanley flew to the West Coast and renewed acquaintances. On a Monday, Bob went into St. Thomas Hospital, not because of anything serious, but just for a rest. One of the ladies there, Lavelle, and I had been talking about television, and Dr. Bob didn't care much for television, but in the end, he found out that he liked to watch college wrestling. So he'd watch television. And then finally, before he died, he got a convertible black Buick Roadster. Roadmaster. He loved cars and had owned many of them, but this was his favorite. Dr. Bob said, this was the car I always wanted. And he got it shortly before he passed away. Friends still remember him speeding through the streets. He just sped through the streets. And people would ask him, why are you still going to meetings? And he said, why don't you stay at home and rest? You're ill. And Dr. Bob said, he said, the first reason that I go to meetings is that this way's working so well. Why should I take a chance on any other way? Second reason is that I don't want to deprive myself of the privilege of meeting, greeting, and visiting with fellow alcoholics. It is a pleasure to me. And third, the reason is the most important. I belong at that meeting for the sake of the new man or woman who might walk through that door. I'm a living proof that AA will work as long as I work AA. And I owe it to the new person to be there. I am an example of sobriety. Alcoholics Anonymous was nurtured around a kitchen table in its early days. There's the picture of the kitchen table in New York, and then in Dr. Bob's house. Most of our most meetings and the best programs have their origin around this modest piece of furniture, the kitchen table and the coffee pot. Maybe we have progressed materially to better furniture and more comfortable surroundings. Yet the kitchen table will always be the appropriate symbol for us of simplicity. We don't have any VIPs, nor do we need them. Our organization has no title holders nor grandiose buildings. This is by design. Experience has taught us that simplicity is basic in preservation of our personal sobriety and helping those in need. Over the years, we have tested and developed suitable techniques for our purpose. They are flexible. We've known all and seen miracles, the healing of broken individuals, the rebuilding of broken homes. And always it has been the constructive personal 12th step work based on an ever upward looking faith which has done the job. Let me reiterate, this is Bob talking, of course, that we AAs are many men and women, and we are of many minds. It will be well for us to concentrate on the goal of personal sobriety and active work. We humans and alcoholics on strict moral stock taking must confess to at least a slight degree of larcenous instinct. We can hardly arrogate the roles of judges and executioners. We should not be judges. And he ends up by saying, 13 grand years to have been a part of it all from the beginning has been reward in itself. He talked about cultivating tolerance and believing in other people. And he, in the middle there, middle paragraph says, I'm reminded of the connection about people with religious ideas. the picture of a hub with its radiating spokes. We all start at the outer circumference and approach our destination by one of many routes. To say that one spoke is much better than all the others is true only in the sense that it's better suited for us. There are many ways. One of my favorite quotes from Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers and from the Akron Manual is, there are a dozen ways to get from New York to Chicago, but they all end up in Chicago. We may have different ways to get there, but we all get to the same place. Dr. Bob was a tremendous supporter of Bill Wilson, frequently sacrificed his own instincts in order to side with Bill. And Dr. Bob had confronted with his own mortality. He agreed to the first international convention. And he was at the convention in June of 1950, July of 1950, and he gave a great speech, a short speech, because he was dying at the time. He was very ill. Part of this, only part of it that I will read, says it would be fitting to lay a little emphasis on a few things. One is the simplicity of our program. Let's not louse it all up with Freudian complexes and things that are interesting to the scientific mind, but have little to do with our actual AA work. Our 12 steps, when simmered down, resolve themselves into two words: love and service. On the Sunday before Doc went into the hospital for was the last time, Bill made a visit to his home, and it's when Dr. Bob said, "Let's keep things simple." And Bill says, a few hours later, I took my leave of Dr. Bob, knowing that the following week he was to undergo a serious operation. Neither of us said anything. We both knew that what was coming. On November 16th, 1950, Dr. Robert Holbrook Smith, age 70, co-founder of A.A., died at City Hospital in Akron. He was cremated in Cleveland, and his remains were buried in Mount Peace Cemetery beside his wife, Ann. The Reverend Walter Tunks, who was instrumental in him meeting Bill, conducted the funeral service. In his 15 years of sobriety, Dr. Bob helped more than 5,000 alcoholics and never took any fee. Bill W. described him as the Prince of the 12 Steppers. Dr. Bob, on November 16th, 1950, and the newspaper, Dr. Robert H. Smith, eulogized. His name was published only after he had died. For the last word, may I leave you, there's I'm going to skip that. This is a plaque. It says the friends of Dr. Bob and Ann Smith would like to thank the sisters of the St. Thomas Hospital, but there's no special monument for Dr. Bob. Just his gravestone. Dr. Tom Scuderi, who had known Dr. Bob since 1934, remembered talking to him on one occasion when he was in the hospital. The doctor asked Dr. Bob, and he said, Dr. Bob said, "I'll be gone in a short time to meet my maker. I'm not afraid." Ann C., who also had known Dr. Bob even before the start of his sobriety, remembered that he talked very freely about death. "You talk about dying like I talk about driving home in the afternoon," she said to him once. "No fear, no emotion, nothing. How come?" And Dr. Bob replied, "Have you ever been at the airport and watched the planes take off?" "Many times," she replied. "For a while you see the plane and then you don't see it," he said. "That doesn't mean that it has disintegrated or disappeared. It has just found a new horizon. That's the way I feel about death. I will have found a new horizon."